There are scientific positions today whose contextual dependency often unknowingly roots implausible, unexplainable, incomplete or precarious context through a narrative of appeasement by bridging unrelated traits together into a functional descriptive acceptable to the norm. Do the premises of scientific inquiry contain constraints wholly dependent on maintaining perceptual balances that favor predetermined contextual correlations as the prima facie of so-called independent analysis? Are surreptitious oxymorons not maintained scrupulously at the expense of independent thinking? We are not talking about thinking out of the box here, since even that runs primarily on contextual ingredients. Truly independent inquiry cannot be made through tools subservient to contextual dependency. Thinking, understanding, and explaining are the tools of context. But if the tools of context are unavailable in the exploration of the unknown beyond context or comprehension, what are the presumptions of its inquiry? Could perception as we know it extend its capabilities as a tool from which to peer into unfamiliar areas of reality? The question is a testimonial that corroborates the perceived state of the inquirer. The answer to the question is the question. It embodies the relationship between the seer and the world he commingles with. That is the context perceived, the manner it is perceived, and the position of assemblage from which the inquiry arises. Any statement, regardless of purpose, voices a situational cognizance, which reflects the assemblage from which perception, as manifested by the seer, illustrates the boundaries of awareness warranted by the shared context within the pretext of conversation. An objectified query is really nothing more than a position in the assemblage of perceptual abilities from which to peer into what is out there, out here, or somewhere. The inquirer's outlook corroborates his/her subjective, objectified experiential state as a reflection of that state. Could one allude that everyone's perception is subjected to the collusion of objectified context? The existence of a preconceptual self would be strenuously debated by the advocates of context as the only definitive source of reality in existence, while the absence of context in early childhood is trivialized by adults who know better. Consider that thinking employs background referencing within a tenuous logical framework, often repeated reflexively. Listen to what is said and how it is being said. Human beings are conditioned to think that their sanity depends on their ability to understand and explain everything comprehensively. Many fall into the obsessive nature of thinking, thus being manipulated while manipulating others by reasonable expectations, fashioning a preponderance to conversation. Our lives are fragmented by the disposition of our outlook. We pursue within a linear time frame what we tell ourselves are the requirements of temporal mental states under siege from socio-cultural, economic age and other denominators. Our acts maintain allegiance to a common view of reality by being at the service of perceptual values we have been oriented to since birth. Most individuals relate to actions with an axiomatic view: to attain their goals, satisfy their desires, and alleviate their needs. Yet modifying specific aspects in our socializing and educational conventions could force us to re-examine predominant perceptual accommodations which may effectively free us from the prejudice we serve so diligently, that our experiential encounters are recognized precisely because they mirror the tools of our discernment. Within an objectified context, we continuously reaffirm the limitation to our perception in everything that we do, and our acuity, fed by our daily routine, merely endorses the limitations of our discernment. Most human beings are creatures of habits captured into set patterns of thinking and doing, taught to them interactively during childhood and after. Explanations become mere reflections of those sets, which means that what is sought cannot be expressed in the language of freedom from the circumstances that define us. Our thinking articulates the very expressions we seek freedom from, and thus cannot offer any escape, since they merely illustrate the very conditions which oppress us. If what is sought cannot be expressed in the language that has redefined the context of what is sought, then that language and its conceptual framework are compromised as a source of freedom from that context. We simply cannot escape from the fishbowl by thinking our way out of it. Thinking, explaining, and understanding are the tools of context. These tools deceive the mind into believing nothing exists beyond the scope and narrative of thinking, explaining, and understanding. Language offers a panacea through content, construct, and a dimensional perspective. It is the Pied Piper that corrals one's awareness by converting everything we see into a description. Language toes the norm, and it is personal. Many human beings talk to themselves incessantly as they maintain their relationship and perceptual balances keyed to conforming normative constructs. Conveyed by the Diamond Sutra, while Indian yogis who practice the knowledge of yoga or jnana yoga speak of it in perceptual battles conveyed in not this, not that. There are distinctive premises of this in metaphysical belief systems, and social scientists such as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis have commented on the subject. If quotations are applicable as in the Western sense of acknowledgements, then perhaps the Diamond Sutra should take precedence at 500 BC. And yet none of this is relevant, since this is not about sources, but more about practices. The known accentuates an outline through repetitive patterns, promoting its agenda through associative context, often taken for granted, freely engaging our perceptual habits, making us available to its designs. Anecdotic expressions have taken over human beings to act as their surrogate. Religious schism in the Middle East, Catholic versus Protestant, and the political right versus the left all represent the consequences of misidentification of true identity, with human beings as the cannon fodder in the endless battles of opposites. We are trained to approach everything through familiar contextual backgrounds so that we can recognize the perfunctory and habitual precedents that standardize our existence. For instance, everything we speak of is defined in a context. Otherwise, we cannot speak of it nor recognize it. This existential context is based on assimilating the normative recognition and interpretation widely employed in our society. We are bonded to it, and to the very narrative from which we derive our social identity and coexistent perception of others, often polarized by the very characterizations playing them. Are we the characterizations dressed into combative personages, or as stand-ins occupying a familiar mindset in a compressed timeline, exploiting our allegiance to context? This definition of experience translates occurrences into recurrences, into what defines us socially, and while we presume to act freely without bias, we are, in fact, enormously prejudiced by the perceptual balances that language automatically submits to us. We see through lenses created by an aggregate of past experiences, relegating our perception to contextual background from which we recognize opportunities, create choices, and participate in our daily affairs. Contextual immersion controls not only what we think, but how we think. We are unable to observe featured distinctions since we've assimilated idiosyncratic features we've identified with. But what of experiences unavailable either due to age, cultural norms, political or religious advocacy, thus limiting the scope, depth and quality of perception? What of experiences we are unable to foresee or beyond our grasp? Can we free ourselves from the conditioned nature which model patterns we've adapted to? Are experiences perceived as dangerous or unsuitable as we make them out to be, or are we simply protecting the sanitized version of reality we've come to know as our own? And at what cost? Consider our relationship to experience as a posture, examined, described, understood, framed and sanctioned. But experience outside of such scrutiny is an experience beyond the polarity of belief, politics and assumptions. It creates a deeper, wider birth at a level of perception impossible to contain within a descriptive reality, yet widely experienced outside the known. Teach2learning.com. Come visit us. 221 copyright text and script.